Hey folks, good morning.
Hey there, Toddy. Doesn't look like we have an agenda this week. Did anybody have topics they want to bring up?
So yeah, maybe what are our next steps with the scenarios? So how do we want to kind of split and work on those and get some priorities? It's kind of question for the group.
I've got the same question. I threw it on Slack last week. I haven't heard anything back yet.
So whatever comes out of this working group, would the big cloud providers be willing to adopt it?
That's the assumption, I guess. And I guess it's not only about cloud providers, but also all registries.
I think the first step could be to take all the client tools that we have and see how they have to do things differently for each registry. If they're doing things differently for each registry, then there is a case to be made for standardizing all of that stuff.
So one of the things that actually we noticed is not only about the clients, but also how the registries handle that thing. I remember we had some issues with authentication when we, for example, import from various registries. Right now I cannot actually tell you which ones because I don't remember. It was kind of last year we had customers saying, well, we had some capability to, let's say, import from this registry into ACR as part of the ACR CLI. And that was not working with certain registries, and customers were complaining because they say, oh, the authentication fails. So we had to work with those registry providers in order to figure out how to authenticate with their particular registry and perform that functionality. So coming back around to your question, so the thing is that the client had to implement something specific for this particular registry in order to properly authenticate. but it's kind of driven from the registry, not from the client. And now, like, we ended up like, okay, if is ACR do this, if it is Docker do that, if it is, I don't know, GCR do something else, right? So
Okay,
so
so there is a case to be made here to standardize some of this stuff.
oh, well, certainly there is, yeah.
For my own code, I think the edge cases I ran into was when I was trying to handle multiple repositories. And so if I was copying from one repository to another on the same registry server, if I authenticate multiple times within one session, I would see different responses depending on what registry I was talking to. Especially if I would do lazy auth and just let the registry tell me that I need to authenticate. If I was already authenticated into one repository, it would give me a rejection instead of telling me to go off and update my authentication. But only a few registries did that.
If I may add, I think one item from this could potentially be an addition to the conformance tests, right? I know that the conformance test already does a bunch of authentication. It takes user password and just to kind of get through the basic scenarios. But we could potentially add the auth recommendations, or how we kind of come up with this to the conformance suite, so that the multi-repository thing and all can be validated. So that way, the spec is also testable in some way. Otherwise, we'll probably have, again, left to interpretation of docs, which, as we all know, is kind of really hard for most people to just get it running.
So
If there's no other topics, because I've been attending some of the previous OCI meetings, and I see a lot of interesting discussion. Especially, I see Brendan handling a lot of it. Really how to get everybody to agree on interesting discussions. So for this scenario, for the security ones, just based on that previous experience for the image distribution, those specs, what do you expect, what kind of a controversy will come up? I just want to get, what do you predict will come up?
I have had open issues on registries where they have directly said closed won't fix on their stuff. They respond that, hey, it works with the Docker client. We're not going to support anybody else. So my hope is that if we get this into the conformance test, that we can start getting a little bit more standardization around multiple clients, not just one client.
My understanding, the early days of OCI, because there's the dominance of Docker, obviously, because it is Docker, that made the standardization a little tricky. But now OCI is already accepted by most people. Is there anything that's similar to the old scenario, like something that's totally being either dominated by one particular project or / vendor? Is there something that's related at this point?
I'm sure there are, but that almost feels like I might get a name calling if I started trying to figure out who they were.
All right. Any thoughts on what we could do next? I think my thinking is that we want to get this into the distribution spec, but it's not being called out as one of the goals of the working group. So should we start at least rough charting out what the goals should be, or like taking action items from there? The conformance test is not being called out. Like we can have like 3 or 4 things that we can finalize from this, right? I know that we want to dock what's the present state, but once we start writing that, maybe we'll see, oh, okay, we never called out that these are the 3 fields that we want to.
Listening to a lot of the older videos, I'm because I'm new to the community. What I find is the SIG architecture and SIG auth of the Kubernetes project seems to have a lot of quote opinions when new things come up, like how to do things, how to authenticate, and all that. Should this go through that process to be reviewed by? I know this it's an even different, totally different foundation, but does it make sense for it to be reviewed by either SIG auth or SIG architecture of a Kubernetes project?
We have some overlapping folks, right? I think my bro is on the Kubernetes forum also, who kind of like wanted to be a part of the reviewing of this. So yeah, definitely have some amount of like cross-pollination of reviews would be good. I would support that. But going officially into the SIG group and presenting this is what we're going to do, maybe, unless somebody wants to volunteer.
Volunteer for too many things already, so I'm not volunteering
no,
today.
That's right. So Mike is not on the call, so that's why I was volunteering for. Just kidding. But I'm sure you would probably review it.
If nothing else, whatever we create is going to go into the distribution spec. It's
Right.
going to get approved by maintainers on the distribution spec just to merge into there, and then approved a second time to get released. So whatever we create over there, it should get looked at, hopefully.
We have called out that the auth group is scoped only for registries, right? You're not going to do any funky client auth with this, right?
The division that we had when we were putting the proposal together is that nobody wanted to get into anything outside of the client to the server interface. They wanted to stick with just that interface, not client to credential helper. They didn't want to look at that. They didn't want to look at client locally or anything along those lines.
Cool.
So hopefully there should be a clean PR to distribution spec.
Since this is related to security, definitely we should have a security review of this, of course, in the scope of the distribution spec. So that I think, so at least there are no glaring holes.
I would say yes from CNCF for Kubernetes. But since we're OCI, I don't know that we have resources to do that assigned to us. So that would be the challenge, is can we get something from Linux Foundation to do that for us or not? It may be more appropriate to get some of the registries that are thinking about implementing it to themselves provide a security review if they've got those resources themselves. Ideally, the direction I'm going to push toward is getting HTTP specs more in here, and those have already been reviewed and gone over countless times by the public.
Okay, so one low-hanging fruit as an action item is to do a landscape survey, the clients and the registries and all the pain points that people have found, right? So that is by itself a problem statement.
So do we have like maybe list what registries we want to survey, what clients? I'll be happy to eventually get that going. So if Brandon allows me to test his registry client.
It is open source. I want to test the
Just kidding.
private ACR out there that nobody lets me know about.
Okay, I'll put maybe an issue on the GitHub repository with proposal, and let's have this conversation over the next couple of days.
The other direction, in addition to trying to get a survey of all the different clients and servers and how everybody works on this, is we do have multiple specs out there. And I wonder if we want to take something like the Docker spec that so many people have been using for so long and build out a workflow decision tree, something along those lines of what happens at each step, and maybe notate, which steps could be something that's just an HTTP standard instead of something we're inventing ourselves. Or even which steps are mandatory versus which steps are optional. I think that'll be another interesting question. Because the Docker spec goes through a lot of procedure of client shell ping the V2 API, and then they will generate this header, and how much of that whole workflow is really necessary versus just send a request.
I'm gonna ask the obvious question here. Who wants to pick up kind of like doing a first draft of this one?
I was playing plan. Oh, sorry, Ram.
No, just a quick question then. Where do we put the output of this? Where are these documents going? Issues? Are they GitHub issues?
We
We have
could
a
do,
GitHub repo, and
yeah.
so any documentation we generate would be good to get merged into the GitHub repo, which there are a couple of open issues. I don't know if they might have gotten merged while I was on this call, but yeah, get those merged over there.
And we could have multiple proposals similar, right? Like it doesn't have to be one doc, or we could start with multiple and aggregate it together as a final one. So even if there are two people working on it, we can take the best of both worlds and merge it together, similar like what we did with the reference type. And then so it doesn't have to be like, no, you can't stomp over. We can independently create maybe proposal A, B, and then this is how the spec looks. The shape of A is better, or shape of this section of B is better. Let's put it together.
Yeah, and we did that for the refers API. We came with multiple proposals and then had the group vote on them. Given the lack of material that I have for this week, you can tell that I didn't have time to sit down and go over the stuff. The thought that I would really like to do is to go over the Docker spec itself and to really flow chart that out. I think that would be useful to start sitting through and saying, okay, here are what all the clients are supposed to be doing. What are people actually doing from this flow chart? What steps do we want to consider moving around or changing?
Isn't that the sequence diagram that Josh sent in one of the first meetings?
We've got a little bit of that, yeah.
There are two parts to it. There's also the credential helper plus the auth between the registry. So we kind of like not step credential helper.
Curiously, the identity token in the example that they've got is 102. Gotta love when someone pulls out the old humorous joke password.
All right. I'm probably gonna get a no, but I wanted to ask Nathan if he wants to take a stab at it for one proposal. And Brennan, I'm sure that you would also have one. So we can get multiple points of representation somehow. And then merge the two or merge the three or how many ever comes along the way.
Yeah, I can generally, I should have some time coming up in the next few weeks. I can take a look at putting some stuff together on this and just go over some of the specs and some of my own experiences of interacting with our universe of registries out there. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm at the point that I'm ready to propose a solution yet. I'm still in the gathering stage of looking through a lot of the specs out there and figuring out what makes sense.
Yeah, that's kind of been my experience. Is it seems hard to find the right spec sometimes for this particular piece of the communication. They're either kind of silent on them, so you don't know if you're looking in the wrong spot or what. But yeah, it's kind of I've been generally frustrated by a lot of these specs. Try to just answer questions: is this required? Is this optional? What's the universe of options that you can have? It just doesn't seem to be necessarily out there in a lot of the HTTP specs and things like that.
Yeah, HTTP has some of them. The challenge we run into is we have not necessarily followed the HTTP specs and what we've implemented.
Okay, you probably need some time to circle back and review some material going forward. Others, any comments?
Nothing for me this week.
Jeff, Avril, you folks have anything you wanted to share? Or if not, we can give back 30 minutes.
I have a quick sort of question, or not a question, but like a request for information. Is there like a pool of specs or some documents that we should sort of have so that everyone can reference it? Like, and these are specs that are just out there. I mean, whatever folks find.
There is a PR that I'm waiting to get merged that links the Docker spec and a handful of HTTP specs that might be relevant. And that is not a final list, but it is a starting point.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. And for anybody watching on the video, pull request number 3 over in the working group auth. All right, last call for topics. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and break for the day.
Sounds good. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody. See most
Thanks,
of the group
folks.
here on Thursday.
Thank you.